Welcome to the Get Unhooked podcast with Jason Coombs, where experience meets insight. Jason Coombs, nationally recognized speaker, best-selling author, and founder of Brickhouse Recovery, shares hard-earned lessons on resilience, leadership, addiction, and mental health. No filters, no fluff, just real stories, practical wisdom, and a deeper look at what it takes to grow, lead, and keep moving forward. Now here's your host, Jason Coombs.
Welcome to an opportunity to take a look at the madness of this disease and the hope that is attached, because awareness and understanding brings about freedom, brings about relief, because it's what we don't understand that we struggle to accept. But if there's a way that we could wrap our heads around it to a degree, whatever that is, then we can make the decision to accept it and work through it. And it goes right back to a book that I recommend and I love. And some of you may have already taken this suggestion. It's a book by Byron Katie called Loving What Is. The premise of this book is, it boils down to challenging the narratives in our minds that we assume and that we tell ourselves and that we rehearse and that we believe, that then causes us to show up a certain way. And if that certain way isn't helpful or isn't accurate or true, then it impacts our relationships with others, impacts our serenity. And so the work, she calls it, or inquiry, is a 4-step process. And the 4-step process is to ask yourself, when you make an assumption, like say your addicted loved one is calling you. You see their name pop up on your phone, and immediately the thought comes into your mind, or the narrative based on your experience, she's just calling for money. He's just calling to ask me for something. And so this work points you to these 4 questions. The first question is it true? Well, based on my experience, yeah, it's true. I mean, that's all he ever calls me for, or all she ever calls me for. Then the second question is, can you absolutely know for a fact that that's true? And that's where you get to this place of, I guess not. Might be calling to share, an announcement, or I'm coming home, or I'm checking into treatment. It could be a number of different things, or I won the lottery, whatever. But it might not be exactly what we assume. And the third question is, with that belief, how do I show up? How am I showing up with the belief that, he's just calling me for money? How do I receive that phone call? How do I answer that? Or how do I feel and not answer that? And then do I rehearse no, this is my boundary, I'm not going to answer it because this is my boundary and I'm not going to give him money. Well, the fourth question is, how would you show up if you dropped that belief? What if you dropped that belief that he's or she's just calling for money, and you answered the phone with a different mindset of, this is my loved one, and this is an opportunity to pour love in. And then if they do ask for money, it's okay, because it's like, all right. I mean, at least it's predictable. But the idea is, at least you're not showing up in the space of being guarded, whether it be resentful. And this could go into every scenario you can think of. This can go into the narratives of, I've seen people transform when they have told themselves the story, the narrative that, well, I'm a survivor, I'm a victim of abuse. That person, whatever that story is about that person, I'm the victim of that. And so there are reasons why I do what I do. Can you absolutely know for a fact that that's true? First of all, is it true? And can I absolutely know for a fact that that's true? This gets into some touchy and sensitive waters, because in some of these scenarios, I have seen the individual who is the victim actually own the fact that they played a role in it. And it was fascinating to see, because that takes extreme radical acceptance and ownership. Not all cases are like that. And I want to be very careful to not make any assumptions or speak to your situation or your loved one's situation or anyone's situation. But what I've seen is that these 4 questions help us challenge the narratives that contribute to how we show up. What would happen if we were to challenge those and drop those beliefs? And how would I show up differently? How would I show up if I didn't think that my loved one was calling me for money? I'd probably show up and say, it's good to hear your voice. It's good to know that you're breathing, you're alive. That, like, it's just going to be a different tone. So why am I bringing this up? Well, there can be times where hope is reached. You see or hear change talk. You see your loved one making decisions that are appearing to be in the preparation stage of change, that change is on the horizon. Maybe there is a little sustained sobriety. They're in treatment. They're not in treatment, but they're doing better. And the hope returns. It's like the bottom falls out. When we look at the chapter, Drink Like a Gentleman, that chapter, which is on page 155, this is the moment where I am celebrating my graduation of drug court. This is stemmed from all of the felonies that I was charged with. And if I was able to graduate drug court, then the judge would drop those felonies to misdemeanors. It's called in the state I was in, it's called a 402 motion. Anyway, this is me, standing up in front of the courtroom, and I'm giving a public speech about how I've changed. I'm expressing gratitude for my family and their support. I'm feeling some emotional pride that I got to that step, that point. And I remember going to lunch afterwards with my parents, and my dad and my mom they each gave me a gift. My dad gifted me a set of golf clubs, which was an invitation to start joining him again and doing something that he loved to do, which was go out and golf. And he gave me a watch that meant a lot to him. This was his way of saying, I'm proud of you, son. This is the end, the closing of this chapter, and now we can move on. The interesting thing about external motivators and milestones like that is that even in those moments, there's still the suffering of emotional instability, of anxiety and depression. And that can happen. That will happen if it's not treated. So that's why I talk a lot about emotional sobriety and the importance of emotional sobriety and recovery, because recovery means different things to different people. And sobriety isn't necessarily my goal anymore. Of course, it's the most important goal when someone is actively using, because it's kind of like that's the key that unlocks the gate in order to get on path. But once you're on that path, then there's the work to become emotionally sober, to heal from spiritual anorexia and begin to nourish that side. That's the soul sickness, and treat the anxiety, the depression, and the anger, and the shame, the inadequacies. So sobriety doesn't always mean emotional wellness. Clean time does not equal happy, joyous, and free. And so understanding that can help us get off of the emotional roller coaster when the day after, or the day, I believe it was the day that I graduated from drug court, I was invited to go celebrate with my coworkers and go out to the border of Nevada to Wendover, the casinos are and whatnot. So I was like, yeah, I could go. And then when I get there, they're, ordering drinks, and the addict voice comes into my mind and says, drugs were your problem, not alcohol. Like, I never got arrested for alcohol. I never got a DUI. I never got in trouble because I just drank alcohol. But what's interesting is every time I got in trouble, alcohol was part of that scenario. And that is another example of how someone can be in a different stage of change about different drugs or substances. For example, I was in pre-contemplation about alcohol use while I was in the preparation and action stage about staying off of drugs. Now, that's very important to note, because I can't tell you how many people will come into treatment and they've got significant weight on their shoulders and consequences that are hanging over them if they do not complete their probation or whatever. But they still talk about how when they're off paper, which is another term for saying when I'm acquitted or my charges are dropped after I complete my probation, I absolutely plan on smoking weed. And they will say that openly in group. Some of them maybe don't say it openly, but they are thinking it. And it's important to just recognize that nuance. Yes, it's insane. I look at it as it's the same noose, different rope, whether it be pot, whether it be fentanyl, whether it be hydrocodone, whether it be benzos, whatever is the hook, it's still got you. It's still a counterfeit version of emotional sobriety. It's still a counterfeit version of personal revelation and conscious contact, which is promised through recovery when we work the 12 steps. So switching substances is often a symptom of unresolved addiction. And just remember that the same noose, different rope. The interesting thing about this is that cravings, it does reignite the cycle when you take that first drink. And this is the insanity of a relapse, is that first drink in Wendover, it was bliss. It was a relief of the pressure valve. If you remember, as I was going through drug court, I went through a lot of stress. Not only did I have a lot of setbacks and back in jail a number of times, went through 3 treatment programs, because I went through another one I went through 2 post drug court, 5 total. It was this experience of, I still was struggling with shame because I couldn't raise my son. I made promises to him that when he was born and I placed him for adoption, that I was going to change my life. But it was like inside there was this spring that was so wound so tight that it was just gonna snap, because I was just anxious and I was running away from my fears and running away from my problems. And what was interesting is the second I felt that relief from the first drink, then the allergy happens. And the allergy is an abnormal reaction to those of us with substance use disorder. And I wanted another one. Eventually, I escalated it to a blackout, some disorderly conduct, loss of control. And in the midst of that, I have an immediate craving for cocaine. And then the reemergence of the addict voice, or in other words, the midbrain hijacking my reason and my values and the promises I made. And it's interesting because relapse doesn't start with the substance. It starts with the untreating of the lie we tell ourselves, or the lie that the addict voice, the slave that we become to the addict voice, or the inner critic, as I've called before. And my friend calls it the inner critic. So this started the worst 9 months of a spiral that I had experienced up to that point. I launched right back into the hardest drugs. I found myself back on crack cocaine, heroin at an increased level. I was stealing. This is the season where I was, get to the point where I had to rob people to get what I needed. And, these are living amends that I'm making, because I'll never be able to make those right with the individuals that I robbed. But luckily I never hurt anyone physically in that space. It escalated also my consequences. I remember in that stage that I was, like I said, I was running from my problems. But in that attempted robbery of the drug dealer with a knife, it was true insanity. And I remember like crawling through the traffic to retrieve those little balloons of heroin and crack that he threw out on the ground to just get me away from him. Like I see back to this clear picture of destructiveness of addiction and the loss of dignity. And addiction hits harder after a period of sobriety. It hits harder. A lot of my friends have, when I say a lot of my friends, the ones that ended up overdosing and passing away, typically it was after a period of sobriety. And then their body wasn't used to that level, and they insanely went back to the same level of use and, overdosed. So this brought a whole new level of the pit of despair. And keep in mind, I had received the gift of desperation. I had received the gift of volition prior to this. But understanding the nature of a mental illness, such as substance use disorder, comorbidity of or co-occurring disorders with anxiety, depression, ADHD, and then having a heart full of shame and a head full of recovery from all of the treatment centers and jailhouse meetings that I went to and AA meetings that I went to, brings a living hell. It's a living hell. And these are the moments that you want to prepare for, to be ready to be the guide, ready to be the influencer, ready to be in a position where you have the trust built, the rapport built, because you're well boundaried, you're off the beach, you're wearing your emotional raincoat, you've repeatedly given them a dose of vitamin N or the word no to all the things that they asked for when they were in pre-contemplation or contemplation. And then you're able to help in those moments. At that time that I was emotionally bankrupt and I was having suicidal thoughts and I was praying to a God that I barely believed in, I did want to make a change when I was in that space. But it was so chaotic and I was so paranoid with drug-induced psychosis that I believe that my higher power knew that I wasn't going to make any changes unless there was a serious intervention. And this is the point where I went and I was hunting for my daily fix. I usually went to the dealer 3-4 times a day because I never had enough to last me through the day, and I never would make it last through the day because my one dealer they had been raided, so they were inaccessible. So I had 3 or 4 dealers that I would always rotate through whenever one was out or whatever. And I ended up going to this one dealer's house, and that is where I knocked on the door, and the DEA opened the door and grabbed me by the shirt, pulled me inside, and started to ask me questions and interrogate me. And I see all these dealers that they were on the ground in handcuffs, sitting there in a line. They were all from another country and they were about to be deported. But luckily I got out of that situation. If you want to read about that story, you can go to the book. I got out of that without being charged. But what I did notice is that they put a surveillance car on me. And even with the surveillance car following me around for 2 weeks, I still couldn't stop. And I still found myself paranoid, constantly hiding from them. I was totally and completely in a psychotic break. And this was the time where I barricaded myself inside my little crack house apartment with my cat, and I had a total breakdown of reality. This is the point in time where divine intervention came in. Not only was it divine intervention that the DEA intervened, but it was also divine intervention that I got a text from my best friend, Dave Pinniger. And it was, in essence, are you ready to get sober yet? I believe my parents reached out to him. They were receiving guidance because they were living off the beach and they were accessing inspiration, and they reached out to Dave. The moment that I responded, I was like, I need help. Can you tell me more about the place that you went to? Because he got sober 3 years before me. I just didn't know what else to do because I knew I was at the end and it wasn't going to look good. So Dave drops everything, comes down from Idaho to where I was living in Utah, and he lovingly rescues me. He rescues me in a way that was a healthy rescue because he came to my aid at a moment where he knew that I was at that pivot point, that turning point. And he helped me get into detox, into the psych ward. He helped me get into treatment. He worked with my parents, and my parents were behind the scenes. They weren't interacting directly with me. Dave was the facilitator of that whole thing, but my parents and he were collaborating. And it was interesting because Dave knew I could change. Like he believed in me. He hadn't given up on me. He knew that there was going to be a point in time where he could make the difference. And his belief in me made all that difference. And the fact that my parents continued to pray for me and those prayers were being answered. They were being answered the whole time. So it was very important that I did a couple of things before I went into treatment. And that was, I wanted to see Nathan, my birth son, before I went in. So we made that happen. And I watched him run around the backyard of his house. And I just remembered the promise that I had made him when he was born. And he was 2 years old at this time. The motivation reignited and I became willing to try again. And recovery starts with willingness, but it's sustained by purpose. As I reflect on the cycle of my relapses over the years, especially this one, think about it as a recycling. That relapse isn't just setbacks, but it's recycling or vacillating through the stages of change. So it's a vacillation of going back to the contemplation stage if I was in preparation, and then back to pre-contemplation, and then back into contemplation, and then back into preparation. So it's this constant flow, moving back and forth. And that's why it can be very maddening if you love someone who is expressing themselves to you and you are hearing contradictions every other hour. It's not because they don't want it. It's because they've moved into a different stage of change mentally at the moment. And so the best thing to do is not to attach to a static statement, but realize that this is a cycle. And as they're going through this, they're resolving their ambivalence, hopefully. And you could guide them. And so I realized that what I was lacking was emotional sobriety in those times that I was sober. That was the missing ingredient. Because I had the gift of desperation, I had the gift of volition, but I had yet learned how to feel the benefits of emotional sobriety when I was clean. And environment and lifestyle, key relapse factors, and they're also key factors to transcendence. So when I introduce recovery to people, I don't talk about just staying clean. I don't talk about just, you got to get over detox and then all your wildest dreams are going to come true. Like just join treatment and everything's going to be fine. No, I really try to help them gain a vision of what their internal environment and their internal lifestyle can look like, and what their external environment and their external lifestyle can look like based on what their interests are. And so a big piece to recovery and emotional sobriety is who we spend our time with. We are the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. So if we're hanging out with losers, we're going to become the 6th, as evidenced by my first round of treatment. And I became the 6th loser. But in my 5th treatment program, I was around individuals who wanted to change. And although I came in as a loser trying to be a con artist and, entitled and want to do everything my way, which we'll get into on another day, the reality is that they showed me and modeled me what recovery could look like. And so as you think about relapse, and as you've gone through relapse with your loved one, I give an example in this chapter about my friend Grace. That's not a real name. That's a pseudonym. But in fact, most of the names in Unhooked are pseudonyms. If I did not get their permission to use their name, I didn't use it. She's the one who was a client of mine, and she was desperate when she came and wanted help because the way it was impacting her kids and family. Well, she was so nervous about getting sober because it was the holidays and they always throw this big New Year's party and everybody comes over to their house and there's always alcohol and it's their tradition. But she really wanted to change. She came to me one day and said, "Hey, I want to put a pause on treatment and start over after New Year's." And I knew where this was going. And what do you think I wanted to say? I wanted to say, "Are you crazy? What are you thinking?" Like all the things that come to my mind. But I didn't, because I've learned some motivational interviewing skills and techniques. And so I just validated it. It's like, is it because it's going to be hard over the holidays? And she's like, "Yeah, I just don't want to feel the guilt of drinking, using while I'm in the program over the holidays." I said, "So it sounds like you've made the decision. You're going to drink." I was like, that's okay. That's okay. It's your decision. Can I ask you a couple questions? May I have your permission? She said, "Yeah." I said, "What was the main reason that you came here?" She said, "Well, it's because I'm tired of having my kids see me drunk, and it's impacting my marriage and it's impacting my relationship with my kids." I said, "Tell me what it was like last year after it wasn't New Year's party. It was I have to clarify, it was a Christmas Eve party." She said, "Well, last year was absolutely horrific. I got so drunk that I missed Christmas morning with my kids." And she started to cry because she felt so much shame. I didn't even have to ask her any more questions. She said, "You're right. I'm not gonna quit treatment. I'm gonna stay sober this year." So we talked about some of the ways that she could set up some boundaries or some, precautions. First was I invited her to maybe punt the party and not do it, but it was already happening because it was her husband's thing. And so I said, "All right, what are some things you could do?" Well, we went through that process, and to make a long story short, she did end up drinking, and she did end up having a horrible Christmas morning again. This time she was in a fight with her husband. Her kids were disappointed in her. It was a horrible Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. And she reaches out to me and I say, "All right, come to my office, let's talk." And this was like maybe a couple days after. And she doubled down on her commitment to sobriety after that experience. So Grace's relapse clarified her desire to live sober. It helped her resolve her ambivalence. And that's an important insight, is that oftentimes relapse is what resolves the ambivalence to move someone forward and change. It does not always have to happen. But if you think about the times that you have set goals to change your diet, nutrition, and your workout schedule, and you're going to change that side of your, like that part of your life. And maybe weeks or months go by, but then there's that one event where there's ice cream or there's cake or whatever. And you're like, "Yeah, all right." And then you're off to the races again. And then the next time you feel sick to your stomach because you've overeaten sugar or whatever it is, you're like, "Why did I ever do that?" And then you're going to hopefully put up better guardrails for the next time, because it helped you move you forward and change because you helped yourself resolve that ambivalence. So Dr. Prochaska, who came up with the stages of change model, the trans-theoretical model, says one step backward in order to take two steps forward. And that helps when we're dealing with relapse and we're dealing with chronic contemplators. So in this chapter, we also go into the 4 C's of family awareness, which is I can't control addiction. I can't cure the addiction. I didn't cause the addiction, but I can contribute to it. And that can be positive or I can negatively contribute to it. And when family members often relapse into their own codependency and rescuing, I think it's helpful to ask yourselves, what is it about my behavior why I keep having setbacks And how do I resolve my ambivalence? And what stage of change am I in when I'm thinking about redefining my boundaries and practicing tough love and allowing natural consequences in one's life to factor into their good, into their progress. So these are ways that you can contribute to not only your own recovery, but contribute to theirs. And then the steps to surrender deserve their own explanation, their own video, their own course, really. And good news is there is a surrender blueprint, and that surrender blueprint is available. And I could give more information about that later. But essentially, the process of the 7 steps to surrender for families is that you, number 1, identify what you can and can't control. Number 2, face and make peace with the worst case scenario. And then 3 is let go of attachment to specific outcomes. 4, grieve the loss of what you hoped for. And then 5, trust in a higher power, that he's got a better outcome planned than you will ever understand. And then number 6, absolutely believe in the possibility of recovery and absolutely believe that your loved one can change, but just let go of the attachment to it, of needing that outcome. So it's not giving up hope, it's actually restoring hope. And then 7 is the action step of surrendering emotionally and spiritually and practically. And that might be in the form of a prayer. That might be in the form of journaling. But you could follow those 7 steps to surrender in the book. So the themes and the takeaways for this chapter of drinking like a gentleman. First of all, that title comes from some recovery literature, which is often quoted from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is like, I thought I could drink like a gentleman, but it turns out I can't. A lot of people can drink like a gentleman, but I take one and I'm off to the races. So a big takeaway is that emotional sobriety matters as much or more as physical sobriety. Of course, emotional sobriety is contingent upon being clean. Number 2 is that relapse is not the end. It's often a part of the journey. It's often a part of that process of resolving that ambivalence. Another takeaway is that polysubstance abuse or changing substances doesn't necessarily equal recovery because they're clean from one substance, but it's all a part of the addiction. Another is that cravings and shame and isolation are dangerous, but they could be interrupted by community, people of influence, and purpose, discovering one's purpose by planting seeds. And think of the law of the harvest, which is there's a season for planting seeds, there's a season for the cultivating the seeds, and there's a season for the harvest, and they're not the same season. Remember that it's important to let go, and really walk through those steps to surrender, detach, trust the process, and remember that pain is often the pathway to breakthrough. Oftentimes we do change at the speed of pain. Think about your own life. If it's not painful enough, you may not make that change, because we're either moving away from pain or we're moving towards pleasure. Those are really the 2 big motivators for human behavior. And just remember that recovery is possible, but it does take surrender, and it takes patience. It takes trust in higher power. And it takes frameworks like this where you can feel peace and be reminded of the simplicity of these things and not get stuck in the weeds. Grateful for your trust in me. I'm grateful that you are being proactive and engaged in your own recovery and learning what is important and what can help. At the very least, I hope that these words are planting seeds in your mind and cultivating seeds that were planted previously, so that in times of real crisis or in times of joy, you can think back and really reap the harvest and feel like all of this work not only helped me during, but resulted in a deeper, more authentic, genuine version of myself that not only can show up for my addicted loved one, but shows up for all of my loved ones and in all of my life domains. And that is the great promise that I leave with you guys. And I do appreciate your trust. So on to the next. On to the next. You got this. I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this show. Thank you for your support. Thank you for sharing these episodes so that they can help others. This is one way that you can give back and pay it forward, is by just passing along this free information to others that are possibly in need. Share it on social media, share it with your loved ones and family members. And don't forget, you can access my book on Audible, as well as on Amazon or on my website. As well as you can find information about our services at Brickhouse Recovery at brickhouserecovery.com.